We're delighted to have you here, and we say thank you to our virtual audience that's out there. So we got physicals and virtuals. You know, we're going to try to make sure that both of these communities are able to engage with us today. And thank you all for coming here. The physicals, we're delighted to have you here. This is really a highlight for us every year. We've had the partnership with Jetro for, 18 years, I think. And it's been so helpful for us to be able to track the evolution, because over this 18-year period, the center of gravity for global economy and for America has shifted to Asia. And we've had a partner to help us along the way with Jetro. And Ishiguro-san, thank you for your leadership at this time. This partnership is very valuable. I don't know how Jetro was lucky enough to recruit Ishiguro-san back into government. I mean, he was in METI for many, many years, but then he went into the private sector and was a very senior advisor at NEC, and somehow they talked him back into government. But it's our good fortune, and we're delighted to have this partnership with Jetro. Thank you. It's so much going on in the world that it's hard to focus on kind of these underlying economic developments. You know, it just gets overwhelmed by the daily news, and yet the pulse that affects most people's lives is occurring all the time quietly around us, and you're involved in all of that. And we're fortunate to have the Special Assistant to the President, Ms. Siegel-Knowles, with us today, who's going to Keynote, going to kick off our conference. We're very happy for that. So many developments have been occurring. Everybody talks about the way supply chains are changing, being transformed. I think we're going to look into that today. We'll talk about that today. I think there's a lot of confusion in that world, frankly. I hope that we're going to talk a bit about the progress that's being made in the Indo-Pacific economic framework. You know, I know there's been a lot of work going on, and of course that's really kind of now the agenda for trade policy in America, because the Congress is kind of frozen. And since the Congress owns trade policy in our legal system, we have to find other ways that we can advance it. And that's, of course, what IPEF is about. So it's going to be a very good morning, and we're delighted that all of you are here to participate. You, the audience, have to make this a stronger conference with your questions, your interaction. So we hope that you will be active in this session today. My role really is to introduce the keynote speaker. That's Christina Siegel-Knowles. She is the Special Assistant to the President and responsible for, and Senior Director for International Economics on the National Security Council. Her second run, I don't know how you got lured back, but her second run in the NSC, these are jobs where it's like dog life. You know, it's 7 years for everyone you log in calendar time. You really get worn down fast, but we're fortunate. She's got deep experience, was in the Treasury Department, actually, and I believe worked in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So she has a rich background and experience to help launch this very important conference. So could I ask you, with your very warm applause, to welcome to the stage the Christina Siegel-Knowles, the Special Assistant to the President. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for having me. And I think just picking up on a theme, I wanted to make this an interactive session. It's early in the morning. I wanted to give a few remarks, but also give time to interact with all of you in the audience as you get started on this important conference. I wanted to start by saying that from our perspective in the White House, the topic that you've chosen for today couldn't be more important. And then also to set the scene with a quote from President Biden, which I think is really relevant to the work that you're going to do over the course of today's sessions. President Biden has said that the alliance between the United States and Japan has grown stronger, deeper, and more capable as we work together on the challenges, just as important as the opportunities of a changing world. Building economic resilience and strength in the face of these challenges is a top priority both in Washington and in Tokyo, and a real concrete area in which Japan and the United States are working together very actively every day. This year, I personally had the opportunity to witness this firsthand as the United States and Japan worked hard to make Japan's G7 presidency a tremendous success. And there were real themes coming out of that G7 presidency and real leadership in bringing not only the United States and Japan, but the rest of the world together around how do we deal with challenges when it comes to economic resiliency, supply chain interdependence. I think when we think about the challenges that we face in the international economic space, they are real. I think is a focal point of this conference, the pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine have really laid bare vulnerabilities in our supply chains. At the same time, the intersection of national security and technology is redefining what constitutes dual use, raising new challenges for how do we use economic tools in a way that doesn't impede trade investment. The climate crisis demands a clean energy transition, and it's become obvious that in order to ensure that the international economic cooperation that has brought so much benefit to the United States, to Japan, to the entire Indo-Pacific region, and the world is sustainable, we need to pay more attention in ensuring that it works for our workers and our communities. But the opportunities amid all these challenges are very real too. And the United States and Japan are leading to the benefit of our shared Indo-Pacific region. That's right, our shared Indo-Pacific region. I think as President Biden likes to emphasize, the United States is a Pacific country. We know that the future of 21st century economy is going to be written in the Indo-Pacific, in our region. And what we've seen over the past 2.5 years is a reflection of both the importance of deep economic engagement with this region and a reflection that this engagement needs to reflect the challenges that we face today. It needs to be a modern international economic engagement. It doesn't need to take the playbook that we've used in the past, but instead needs to think about those real challenges that I just laid out and embed that in the way that we deepen our economic cooperation and the way that we chart a path for economic cooperation that's going to be sustainable in the future. I think today the United States and our regional partners, not just Japan, but across the region, recognize that success in our cooperation depends not just on robust two-way investment flows. Those are very important. We should continue to value those. But also on how we sustain those investment flows and trade flows in a way that builds secure supply chains, harnesses the clean energy and digital transformations, and broadly drives shared growth. You'll see this in the President's agenda here at home, and we think that really when it comes to our international cooperation, part of that, an integral part of it, and not something that's in tension with that, is the investments that we are making in the strength of the US economy. We think that should be something that is for mutual benefit, something that helps our economic partners around the world and gives us a platform of strength in which we can build our cooperation. And in light of that, we're making once-in-a-generation levels of investment in restoring US industrial capacity and building resilience. With historic legislation, we're unlocking investments in infrastructure, emerging technologies, and clean energy, areas that will form the backbone of our economy's growth over the coming decades. Areas where we need to expand the nation's productive capacity, but not just, very importantly to that point on this being something that is broadly shared with our partners and allies, it's not just enhancing our productive capacity. The world needs more productive capacity in these areas, and therefore a robust program of investment is an intention and is in fact supportive of our deep cooperation with partners in the region. And when we think about this, just to be clear, our modern American industrial strategy isn't about abandoning the ideas that markets generally work. It's about recognizing that there are areas where markets just don't fully price in externalities, like climate, like national security, that impact our well-being and also impact the way that we should be pursuing sustainable economic cooperation across borders. It's also about recognizing that there are areas where there's an unlevel playing field. Markets are not going to correct a situation in which actors are not just putting their thumb on the scale, but in some cases putting their fist on the scale. So we need to think actively, how do we address places where the playing field for economic cooperation is uneven, and how do we do that in cooperation with our allies and partners? So in addition to the steps I spoke about the efforts that we're taking at home, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. Second piece of the puzzle is thinking about how do we work with our allies and partners, including in the Indo-Pacific, to develop solutions together. I've already spoken a little bit about US-Japan cooperation, and happy to continue speaking about that, but we're also taking steps with other partners in the region, Vietnam, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, and others that will set both the United States and our partners up for success in building industries, jobs, and the industries and jobs of the future. For example, in September, in Vietnam, President Biden launched a landmark partnership to expand the capacity of the semiconductor ecosystem and to support US industry in Vietnam, as well as Vietnamese industry. Again, this is an example of how, as we build our supply chain resilience, as we address the challenges that we see, we can enhance the cooperation and benefit not only the United States, but partners around the world. We've also launched initiatives on critical and emerging technologies with India and Singapore that reflect the importance of new digital and technology-focused partnerships for future growth. These are just a few examples of our bilateral cooperation. I could keep going, but again, I said I was going to try to leave some time for questions, so I'm happy to dive into other bilateral partnerships that you all are interested in talking about as we get to the question section. In addition to the bilateral relationships, we've already talked about what the United States is doing on the multilateral front. We are really investing in forging new regional economic relationships through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. Many of my colleagues in the National Security Council, USTR, and the Department of Commerce have spent several months negotiating a first-of-its-kind partnership that will support two-way trade flows, making supply chains more resilient, facilitating the clean energy transition, and fighting corruption. So it's a trade partnership that takes the challenges that I laid out in the first instance and puts it right at the center. Rather than ignoring or working around it, we're thinking about how do we use a partnership agreement and to deepen our solutions to those challenges in a way that benefits not only the United States, but partners and allies. We are on track to achieve meaningful outcomes in all of these areas in the days ahead and lay a foundation for a new framework for regional economic cooperation. Finally, thanks to Japan's leadership, we have demonstrated unprecedented unity going outside of our Indo-Pacific region through the G7. In Hiroshima in May, the G7 came together and made it clear that we are united in working together to build resiliency in our supply chains, united in our efforts to reduce strategic dependencies, and united in our commitment to the clean energy transition and taking ambitious steps for our planet. We've made it clear that we're on the same page when it comes to upgrading our toolkits for safeguarding technologies vital to national security, and we took steps to address economic coercion. Finally, and importantly, we are aligned on a set of principles that guide all of our relationships in the G7 when it comes to working with China. We are making it clear that while we are de-risking and diversifying our economies to address some of the challenges that I've been speaking about, we're not decoupling, and we have no intention to do so. I'd be happy to dive into all of these topics, but I thought I'd zoom in on just two before I open up for questions. And I chose the two that I think may be most relevant for the rest of your day, given the topics that you've chosen to focus on. First, as I've said throughout my remarks, we think it's just vital and common sense that we need to take meaningful steps to reduce supply chain dependencies and also address, as we're doing that, vulnerabilities to economic coercion. I think it's just not credible to see what had happened during the pandemic in our supply chains, what we saw after Russia's war of aggression with Ukraine started to European and other energy supplies, to continue as we were, which is to ignore concentration risks in our supply chains. That doesn't mean that we should pull back from international economic interdependence. We just need to be more thoughtful in the same way that we address concentration risk in other areas. For example, in financial services, for years, we've thought about how do we balance the benefits from having economies of scale with also the need to diversify in order to ensure resilience. I think the key things for us are that when we think about how do we do that, we're using all of the different lines that I spoke about earlier. We're investing at home through the trifecta of legislation that President Biden has signed into effect. We're cooperating with partners bilaterally strengthening supply chain work with countries from a wider variety of countries in a way that benefits not only the United States, but benefits economic development around the Indo-Pacific region. And we're looking at broader regional partnerships like IPEF as a way to further reduce supply chain dependencies in a way that brings prosperity to all involved. In addition, we're trying to think about where could those dependencies be used against us and also against countries in the world, and this is something where Japan has shown incredible leadership. At the G7, and it was really Japan's vision that drove this, we launched the Coordination Platform on Economic Coercion to increase our collective assessment, preparedness, deterredness, and response to economic coercion, effectively the weaponization of the supply chain dependencies in order to coerce a country into doing something that is against its political or democratic interests. My second area, in addition to the work that we're doing on supply chain, which is your headline for the conference, I did want to say a few words on a very closely related area that we've been working together with partners around the world on, which is thinking hard about, in the modern era, in order to make sure that our supply chains are resilient, in order to make sure that we have sustainable economic relationships, and we're making sure that we're able to continue our openness when it comes to trade, we also need to think about where are the areas where our economic tools might be necessary to protect national security. And we need to think about how do we do this in a way that does not impact our general commitment and our longstanding commitment to openness in trade and investment. But we also need to recognize that technology is evolving, and that means the nature of dual-use items is changing. And so we need to think about how do we, in a narrow way, in a targeted way, and in a way that's consistent with our overall economic frameworks, make sure that actors that could use the technologies and innovations that we create around the world are not able to acquire those and use them against us. Last October, we, in the United States, implemented carefully tailored export restrictions on the most advanced semiconductors and the tools necessary to make them. We recently updated these rules, both to make clear that these controls are not focused, again, on interdependence in normal consumer trade and not focused on consumer chips, but also to tighten loopholes and to make sure that the high-end chips and equipment that these controls are intended to address are in fact controlled. This summer, we also announced a program to control certain U.S. outbound investments in sensitive technologies in countries of concern with a core national security nexus. We worked hard over several months to make sure this program is really narrowly tailored and targeted to protect our national security interests while maintaining our longstanding commitment to open investment. Again, as we think about that need to protect technology, we need to be thinking about this as part of our overall efforts to make sure that our economic cooperation around the world is done in a way that's sustainable, it's done in a way that benefits our partners, but it's also done in a way that is open-eyed around about the realities that we face in a changing world. That's something that I think Japan has shown particular leadership on, especially in its G20 year, but also more broadly in our partnership. It's something where we are working with partners around the Indo-Pacific to increase the impact, both in terms of the effectiveness for the United States, but also in a way that we think genuinely benefits our region and benefits the goals of this conference, which is to think about supply chain resilience as well as economic growth. Now, I could go on for a lot longer. I could go through every element of this really robust agenda. I could go into more depth on supply chains. But I think that rather than doing that, I'd rather have the opportunity to speak with some of you and understand if you have questions, places that we can dive in a little bit more detail and have a little bit more interaction. I think just to emphasize as a close the remarks, just how important is the cooperation that we place, the importance that we place on the cooperation that we have with Japan as our ally, and as an ally where we are increasingly working together on the crucial issues when it comes to economic resilience and security around the world, but also with the rest of the region, the Indo-Pacific region, where together we are leading and together we are deepening partnerships in a way that we think will benefit all of us and make economic cooperation more sustainable in the future.
Thank you, Christina, for really terrific and comprehensive remarks. I'm Chris Johnstone. I'm Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here. I'll take the liberty of a question or two, if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
Christina, first, I want to, as we approach the APEC meetings, I think there's some anticipation of announcements related to IPEF. You suggested that there would be meaningful outcomes that we would be seeing in the days ahead. I wonder if you could share with us a bit about what we can expect to see, and particularly on the trade pillar. There was some press today suggesting that those negotiations are still ongoing and that there may not yet be agreement on a digital component. So interested in whatever you're able to say about those items at this time. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, I think, as I said previously, and as you alluded to, we are expecting a robust set of outcomes on IPEF in the coming weeks. I think we've worked hard with partners around the region, and I think seen real enthusiasm for this type of trade agreement. Or sorry, I shouldn't say trade agreement, partnership agreement, because it's not per se a trade agreement. And maybe that actually, my misspeak, speaks to my sort of key answer to your question. I think people have been focused on IPEF to look for, does it have a market access element? Is it going to have reduced tariffs, et cetera? I think that's sort of missing the point of how we are thinking about IPEF. I think we have recognized that some of the agreements that we pursued in the 90s were really exclusively focused on market access or overly focused on market access as being the only element of an economic partnership agreement. I think as we think about IPEF, we are expecting really robust outcomes at this time in the areas of supply chain resilience. I think first of its kind agreement on how do we get at some of the issues that you were about to discuss over the course of today. How do we make sure that we have a regional agreement that really speaks to the challenges that we face when it comes to supply chain overdependency, concentration risk, and how do we use the IPEF framework to deepen partnership and diversify our supply chains in a way that benefits all the partners. We're looking at really robust outcomes in an anti-corruption agreement, creating the framework for how do we cooperate and make sure that we're doing so in a way that benefits the populations of all of our countries and in a way that it enhances good governance, enhances the possibilities of investment. We're looking also at really robust outcomes in trade facilitation. So we've got a suite of outcomes. I think whether we at this time take forward a sort of market access or traditional trade element, I think is not going to be the way that I would judge the success of IPEF. I would think about it as a platform that we're hoping to continue to deepen our partnership and demonstrate that we can do something in the space of economic partnership that goes beyond and some of the things we've done in the past and really hones in on the challenges that we're seeing today.
Great, thank you. And if you'll permit me just one more.
Sure.
Related to IPEF. Is IPEF complete at the APEC meetings? And if so, or if not, what does the administration's regional economic integration approach look like after the APEC meetings as we head into next year?
Yeah, so I think we are obviously discussing IPEF with all of our IPEF partners and thinking about it. But I think from the U.S. perspective, IPEF is something that we designed to be a true partnership. I don't think we had designed it to be a sort of point in time. We'll do one round of negotiations and on a few set of issues. It's something that we are thinking deeply about. How do we build our partnership with the Indo-Pacific region and have a value proposition that works for all of the countries who have joined IPEF? And so I would say that the answer is absolutely when it comes to our engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. We should not think about IPEF as an endpoint. We should think about the United States' engagement in this region as being something that reflects the genuine beliefs of President Biden that we are a Pacific country and that the future of global economics is in the Indo-Pacific region. And so we need to be engaged. We will be continuing to deepen a partnership. And so our work in the run-up to APEC is not sort of an end point of our cooperation. It's something that I would say is part of a continuous work to deepen that partnership and something that this administration will continue.
Thank you very much, Christina. We appreciate your time, the time you took to come over here. So please join me in a round of applause for Christina. Okay, well, my thanks again to Christina Siegel-Knowles for joining us this morning. I think that was a great way to kick off our session today. Again, I'm Chris Johnstone. I'm Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here at CSIS. And I'd now like to welcome Ishiguro Norihiko, the Chairman and CEO of the Japan External Trade Organization, to the podium to offer his remarks. And again, we're grateful to Jetro for the partnership with CSIS over so many years. Chairman Ishiguro has had a lengthy career with the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, joined back in 1980, I believe, when it was still referred to as MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. In his capacity there, he worked on policy on the manufacturing industry and commerce, as well as general economic and industrial policy. And after his METI career, he was a senior executive vice president at the NEC Corporation. And as Dr. Hamre noted, Jetro succeeded in luring him back into government. So it's really a pleasure to have Chairman Ishiguro with us here this morning. And sir, I welcome you to the podium for your remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Very kind introduction. Warm welcome to all of you joining us today. I would especially like to thank President Hamre and the staff of the CSIS for preparing today's conference. This is my first time to have the pleasure of participating since becoming chairman of the Jetro this April. But as most of you know, this joint CSIS Jetro conference has been held under the theme of the trade and economic integration in the Indo-Pacific every year since 2005, as President Hamre mentioned. This is indeed a rare accomplishment in times of such a rapid change. It loses out to the APEC summit, but it at least has more history than G20, which was first held in 2008. For this year's conference, we decided to focus on the global supply chains. The environment surrounding supply chains has undergone dramatic change over the past few years. COVID-19 has disrupted the supply of the critical commodities such as pharmaceuticals and semiconductors around the world. In the midst of the tension between the US and China, various countries have enacted various measures for economic security, including tighter export controls. At the same time, we are seeing supply chain issues in need of the address from the perspective of the sustainability, such as the decarbonization and human rights. These changes in the environment are also reflected in the trade statistics. When comparing the first half of the 2023 with the same period 2 years ago, we can see relatively high growth in trade within the USMCA region, between the US and the EU, and between the China and ASEAN. In contrast, trade growth between China and the US and China and Japan are declining. It seems a trend toward stronger trade relations among the like-minded and the neighboring countries is beginning to emerge. Japanese companies are also reviewing their supply chains. In Jetro's survey of the Japanese companies in Asia and Oceania, approximately 60% of the manufacturers said they will review their supply chains in the near future. The reason why is, in addition to the rising cost of the raw materials, the risk of the supply chain disruptions. At the same time, they are changing their stance towards the business with China. Only 33.4% of the Japanese companies in China said that they will expand business in the next 1 to 2 years. This is a record low since the survey began in 2007. China remains one of the most important markets for the Japanese companies, but there appears to be less well-expanded business there. Some companies are transforming part of their production from China to ASEAN and other countries. Jetro is involved in an effort to subsidize the cost of the Japanese companies establishing or expanding manufacturing facilities in ASEAN and other countries. Since 2020, we have supported a total of 129 projects in fields such as automobile, electronics, medical supplies, and semiconductors. ASEAN is growing more important for global supply chain. Expectations are also high for India as a new production site and procurement source in the future. India's population overtook that of China this year to become the world's largest. In a Jetro survey on the Japanese companies in India, more than 70% said they intend to expand business in the future. This is the highest percentage among the countries surveyed in the Indo-Pacific. India is already making its presence known within the global supply chains. Apple is now manufacturing iPhone in India and exporting to the US market. With the expansion of the smartphone exports to the United States, the share of the India exports to the US has grown significantly from 12.3% in 2013 to 17.7% in 2022. The US chip maker Micron has also announced a new semiconductor assembly plant in India. However, challenges have been pointed out in India. In terms of the infrastructure, they include stable power supply and laws and ports. In terms of the business-related procedure, they include customs clearance. Meanwhile, India is participating in a supply chain agreement, the second pillar of the IPEF, or Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I look forward to the panel discussion on India's potential. The environment surrounding supply chain in the Indo-Pacific is becoming increasingly uncertain and complex. Here, I would like to bring up 3 points that I think should be carried out by the government in the region, including the United States and Japan. The first is providing support so that reliable supply chains can be established. I believe that it is important to make an international framework that reduces dependence on countries of the concern for the critical minerals, semiconductors, and other important commodities, and to share information during the emergencies. In this regard, the fact that the IPEF supply chain agreement was substantially concluded after only 1 year of the negotiation is groundbreaking. I would like to express my respect for the leadership of the United States government. I have high hopes for its steady implementation by participating countries. The second is transparent export control based on a common principle and rules. The small yard and high fence policy, for instance, through the global supply chain, parts, raw materials, and products cross borders every day. Different rules for each country can be a big burden for companies. I believe that this dialogue between private companies and government is important in rule making. And the third is maintaining free and fair economic order based on rules. It appears some countries are taking advantage of the economic dependence to engage in acts of the economic coercion, such as banning exports or import of the certain items. Protectionism is also a growing concern. Recently, China banned imports of the seafood from Japan without scientific grounds. However, undeterred, we at Jetro are working to develop alternative markets. We hope that the people of the United States will enjoy eating scallops and other delicious Japanese seafood as much as we do. The Indo-Pacific has driven global growth through the free trade. A rules-based economic order is essential for this to continue. To this end, economic frameworks and FTAs such as IPEF, which address the 21st century concerns, and CPTPP, to which the UK has recently agreed to join, and also RCEP are laying the groundwork for rules in the region. We hope that the US will return to the CPTPP. This is the earnest wish of Japan. This was a message consistently delivered by my predecessors at this conference. It would give me a great joy to be able to see it happen during my tenure. I also that APEC, which will soon hold its summit meeting in San Francisco, can play an important role in maintaining the free trade regime. And on the top of this, I believe it's vital to restore the function of the WTO as a rule-making and a rule-keeping body. Finally, as the global economy becomes increasingly uncertain, the partnership between Japan and the United States is more important than ever. There is a great potential for Japanese-US collaboration in areas such as the research and development of the critical commodities, innovation, and the clean economy. I believe that our two countries should work together to provide leadership for sustainable growth in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, we are joined by a distinguished group of the experts from around the region to discuss these topics. I hope that today's conference will help participants consider ways to strengthen supply chain resilience for sustainable growth in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you, Chairman Ishiguro, for those really terrific remarks. I was struck in particular by your charts about interest in investment among Japanese companies from your last survey, and the decline in interest in China and the increase in other parts of the region. Really very interesting, and I think sets the stage quite nicely for the next part of our panel in our event this morning. We're going to pick up the discussion now with a group of really distinguished scholars and experts. I'll introduce them each in turn, and then we'll invite them to make some remarks. First, on my right, Todo Yasuyuki is a professor at Waseda University's Graduate School of Economics on the Faculty of Political Science and Economics. He received both his PhD and master's degrees from Stanford University, and his recent work focuses on the impact of firm networks on economic activity. To his right is Shanti Shamdasani, who is the founder and CEO of ASEAN International Advocacy and Consultancy, a strategic public policy and government affairs firm. She also created the ASEAN CEO Think Tank Working Group, consisting of top CEOs of multinational companies in the region to provide consultations to business leaders around the region. To her right, Dr. V.S. Seshadri is a senior fellow for international trade at the Delhi Policy Group. He was a member of the Indian Foreign Service for many years, served in a variety of diplomatic posts that included Nairobi, Brussels, Bangkok, Tehran, and Washington. And now, as I said, an expert, a senior fellow for international trade at the Delhi Policy Group. And last but not least is our very own here at CSIS, Emily Benson, the director of the Project on Trade and Technology, senior fellow of the Jetro Chair in International Business here at CSIS. She focuses on trade, investment, and technology issues and has really done some path-breaking work on a number of these emerging areas in national security. So each of our panelists have prepared short remarks on the nexus of supply chain resilience and economic growth in the Indo-Pacific region from their various vantage points. I'll invite each of them to make remarks. I may ask a question or two following those remarks, and then we'll be sure to have time at the end for questions from the audience. So with respect to questions, before we get started, as I said, I'll field some from the audience. I invite our in-person audience. You'll line up over here when we get there at the microphone. And for those of you online, you can submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions box. So with that out of the way, Professor Todo.
So from here or from...
You can speak from here.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Once again, my name is Yasuki Todo from Waseda University. I'm still waiting for my slides. I would also like to thank the conference organizers of CSIS and Jetro for inviting me to this great conference. Actually, I have too many slides, so I skipped some, but these slides are available online in the website of the conference. So let me start with some results from my simulation study using firm-level data for more than 1 million firms in Japan. I found that when imports from China were disrupted by 80% for 2 months, the value-added production of Japan would reduce by 40%. This is a very substantial effect because the effect of import disruption will propagate through domestic supply chains and thus is magnified very much. So I skip this. And to mitigate this large economic possible effect, loss, Japan needs to reduce its reliance on China in supply chains. However, if you look at these figures, you can see that Japan's imports of specific products like electronics and auto parts still heavily rely on China. Chairman Ishiguro actually mentioned that the reliance on China is declining. I mean, the prediction by Japanese firms is declining, but still, if we look at current data, it's still very high. The share of China in these imports is still 40%. And for what the US is successfully reducing its reliance on China in these imports. But then if you look at the total trade between Japan and China, it's recently declining a lot, like by 30% compared with the peak of in the late 2021. So currently, Japan heavily rely on China in supply chains of critical products, but reduces the total trade with China. So this is not a good situation for Japan to maximize its economic benefits and resilience. So, and I suppose that there are two types of information asymmetries for this unfavorable situation. So one is that risks of transaction with China due to national security issues are not very clear to the private sector. So private companies are still relying too much on Chinese imports of critical products to maximize their incorrectly predicted profits. Second, the yard or the targets of restrictions on imports to China are unclear to the private sector. So the private companies are worried about future restrictions and also punishment so that they would reduce exports to China of even non-critical products too much. So to balance economic benefits and national security, The Japanese and US governments should provide clear messages regarding China risks to the private sector, and also set up clear rules for export and investment restrictions. And to reduce the reliance on China, we also need to expand, Japan and the US also need to expand the friendshoring with the Global South, particularly ASEAN and India. This is because, because of current cost effectiveness and the future economic size of the Global South. However, if you look at this figure, the foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector from Japan to ASEAN or India is not actually increasing much. And China's share is also stable, kind of. And also we have to realize that the Global South is now trying to balance between the US and China, and will never decouple completely from China. So Japan and the US need to provide the Global South more benefits from participating in our supply chains through, for example, private direct investment. And to promote the FDI to the Global South, we need policies to lower informational barriers for business matching. And it can be facilitated by utilizing, for example, IPEF, like an international framework, like IPEF, and also export and investment promotion agencies, such as Jetro. And also, Japan and the US should promote infrastructure development and technical assistance in the Global South. And for this purpose, the two countries can cooperate together to be effective. And also, Japan's new Official Development Assistance Charter, which is more flexible than before, can be helpful. Another barrier to the friendshoring in the Global South is the differences in political and economic freedom between the West and the Global South. This figure shows that differences in the level of democracy tend to lower bilateral trade volume. This one is showing the same conclusion for differences in economic freedom. So, for the win-win situation between the West and the Global South, the West needs to be more flexible to these differences in political and economic freedom, and as well as other issues like sustainability and labor issues. And the West should try to promote political and economic freedom in the Global South only gradually. So in this regard, I'd like to suggest that Japan can play a significant role because Japan understands the Asian values more, so that we can bridge the US and the Global South in Asia. So finally, I would like to emphasize the importance of knowledge networks for supply chain resilience, because innovation enables a substitution of materials and inputs when the supplies are disrupted. So, and one of my studies showed that international research collaboration can promote the quality of innovation very much, so that I would like to suggest that we need a research collaboration among like-minded countries, which I call knowledge friendshoring. And again, for this purpose, we need policies to lower informational barriers for matching innovation partners. So it can be done by utilizing international frameworks such as IPEF and public agencies such as Jetro. And I'm actually very much happy to see that several policy attempts recently to promote research collaboration between Japan, the US, and Taiwan in the semiconductor industry. So I stop here, and this is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
That was terrific, Dr. Choi. I'm particularly struck by your graphs that show the continued heavy reliance on China in a number of key areas, and that despite the stated commitment to friendshoring, in fact, the role of China still looms large. Maybe I could ask you just to say a little bit more about what Japan is doing to advance a meaningful friendshoring agenda, what more could be done, and what areas are potential for cooperation between the United States. You touched a little bit on that, but I wonder if I could draw you out a bit more on that particular point.
So you mean friendshoring with the Global South?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I think we can cooperate in terms of infrastructure development. So maybe Japanese government and the U.S. government can have a joint project in the Global South for some infrastructure projects. Or actually, we can utilize existing international institutions like ADB or the World Bank for this purpose. So I think infrastructure development is one of the areas we can cooperate.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Ms. Shamsadani. Please, over to you. Shamsadani.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like first to thank Jetro and CSIS for having me here today. So it's kind of like a huge agenda to discuss about the supply chain and where it is actually going. Before I came to US, I just arrived yesterday, and before I was in DC. In the last 2 months, I've been to Japan, China, India, and then to US. So really, there is a lot to share about, but I don't want to overshoot the time. Wanted to just straight away get into the sharing the information on the supply chain issues. Before I start, I want to ask a question. How many of you have heard about supply chain before COVID?
Minority.
Okay. Do you know why I asked this question? Because what COVID have shown us is that how critical supply chain is. None of us, we thought our goods, and we look at the containers going in every day and at the port and all that thing, and we didn't kind of like bother. We thought, it's their own thing, right? But after COVID, and after the Suez Canal issues where we lost around $10 billion, all of us begin to look at what is this supply chain, and then a lot of think tanks and analysts like myself start looking into the aspect of how to make supply chain more efficient, more effective, and more less costly, right? So I was in China just last week at the East Asia Summit, and they took me around to show the port in Haikou. It's 3 times the size of Singapore. It's a special economic zone. I repeat, 3 times the size of Singapore, just for economic zone. And when they were just explaining with their high technology and all that, I was amazed, and I thought, it will take them another 15, 20 years to build them. And they were showing how housing estates, international schools, is planned to be built there. And then I asked them when would be the completion, and they said it's been operational for the last 4 years. And I was like, okay, and they took me around to look at the facility, right? The reason why I'm sharing this with you is that for some countries, supply chain management is critical. And for some countries, it's not on top of their agenda. I think this is the first thing I would like to establish here, is that why it is for some countries critical and why for some countries it's not the top of the agenda. However, we also look at why countries are opening up special economic zone, really looking into diversifying their supply chains, making it more transparent, more effective. is so that they can take the benefits of, trade blocks like RCEP, CPTPP, IPEF, and a few others. And the large corporations wants to be, a part of this growth. But small and medium corporations, they don't really know what RCEP or CPTPP is or IPEF is. And, we have been working with Jetro for the last maybe 7 years conducting some survey on how much the businesses really understand what these trade blocks are and what it offers to them. And, only 30% of them understood, and the rest 70% really either have no clue or doesn't understand this. So coming back to the supply chain and how we basically look into the future format of this is that one thing I must say after my trip from Japan and China and India, I think we see that the region is getting more and more protective. And this is happening globally. Every market would protect their domestic requirements and domestic demands. Southeast Asia is a region on a roller coaster, I would say. They are trying to catch up with the digital transformation. They're trying to catch up with a lot of technologies that they know they have left behind. I'll leave the South global for now because I think that would be a separate and a long discussion here. But the role that Japan has played, at least to my observation in Southeast Asia, is to keep the region sane. And I think Japan has kind of like slowly helped us guide to where the focus is and how to methodically go about doing it. There's so many things happening in front of us today that, we hardly have time to grasp all of it, right? Now, the climate change, the net zero emission, the blue energy and whatnot, the critical minerals, all this is happening at the same time. The question is, where do we focus first? And what do we need to do moving forward? Because that's critical. You can't focus on everything at the same time. You can't focus on climate change and the critical minerals. You look into critical minerals, it's going to disturb the climate change because critical minerals requires us exploitation of the natural resources, which is going to have an impact. So not one is free from the other, right? And this is where we need the right, accurate balance in terms of how do we actually drive this, I would say, global transformation agenda. We need transformation. And why we need transformation is because we realize that we are not efficient today and we cannot do it alone. And hence we have the cross-border partnership, we have the comprehensive foreign trade agreements that's taking place. So these are basically the kinds of tools. We have a lot of tools in front of us. The question is, how do you pick the tools and how do you actually utilize it? Picking all the tools at the same time and trying to utilize it is not the right way to go ahead with it because you can't just accomplish everything in just one go. So coming back to the supply chain resilience, another concern I have here, and because I only have 7 minutes to speak, so I'm going to just keep it short. Another concern I have here is that the supply chain management so far at the ports, whether it's airports or seaports, traditionally has been manually managed by customs, the logistics companies, and there's a lot of other chains, value chains associated with it. When we realized that modernizing the supply chain would require the intervention of technology, that means reducing the intervention of manpower. In some of the developing countries, that could be an issue because the employment aspect would disturb the whole thing. There's a lot of employment in the logistics and the supply chain values. So just looking at that itself is going to be a tall task. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it can be done. But what is almost impossible, and this is the last point I'd like to make when we talk about supply chain and really modernizing it and making it seamless, the way I have seen in China recently, for example, is the transparency aspect. Now, transparency means that you need to really show where the goods comes, the financial aspects and all that, and we all know that a lot of corruption cases takes place in this logistics industry. The question is how easily can we break this, and how quickly we can actually modernize all the logistic companies. I'm talking for Southeast Asia countries and most of the Asian countries. This is where a lot of labor markets are there, and this is where a lot of corruption cases does take place as well. So, and then another last point is the cost. By modernizing and putting it high technology within the supply chain, are we able to reduce the cost, or we will increase the cost? Because technologies requires a lot of money, and those businesses who have implemented this would need that recovery soon. So again, there are a lot of challenges here. I'll not get into the China tension. We already have a lot of tension going on with the Russia and Ukraine, and then we are looking into some potential tension within Taiwan, China, another thing. But the way we see things moving forward is we need to align the global supply chain and the global businesses so that we can depend on each other. And I think the interdependencies is there. Decluttering or basically decoupling one or the other would not be the viable solution. So it is a tall task, the global supply chain. The word that we have not heard, most of us have not heard before COVID, have now come to surface, and we are talking about it. The challenge moving forward would be how we actually manage to resolve this, and IPEF, I think, is one of the strongest tool here I see, and it's got a big promise to see how we can reshape our global supply chain moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those great remarks. So, I want to, if I could, draw you out a little bit more on IPEF. You talk to business leaders across Southeast Asia. You have really sort of a region-wide frame. Talk to us a bit about the impact of the IPEF agenda from your perspective, and in particular the supply chain pillar, which is the one part of the IPEF agenda that's complete. You suggested that it's potentially a valuable tool. Could you say a little bit more about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think IPEF has taken a different format, which I think I really like the format. I've spent 17 years in negotiations, either at RCEP, EU, CHEPA, and ASEAN, China, and other negotiation. IPEF is different in the sense that it looks at partnership, like what was said earlier, right? But the way IPEF could actually be impactful in this matter is that to really break the pillars down. There are 3 pillars in IPEF, and I think the global supply chain is one. But within the supply chain, there are a lot of other smaller elements there. So in order for IPEF to really drive this agenda, it's on the right track. The thing is whether the train in this right track is moving or not moving. I think that's going to be the key. In order to drive this is to break down the supply chain into various working groups and also sub-working groups to look at each of these critical elements that we need to really modify or transform moving forward. I think that would be the key here. Having the high-level dialogue meetings are good, but often what we forgot is we forgot the middle and the low-income businesses, like the small, medium, the SMEs in the process. And then when we realize a lot of the supply chain benefactors are also the SMEs. So really having an inclusive dialogue, getting right to the bottom of it, and really coming up with an implementable solution and implementable plan of action.
Thank you, Ms. Shamdasani. Let's now turn to Dr. Seshadri, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. And first of all, thanks to CSIS and Jetro for inviting me to this conference. I would start by saying that it's now fairly well recognized that trade and manufacturing concentration, whether in a product or a component, carries disruption risks. Now, disruptions can happen when economies seek to create huge capacities and market shares and then leverage them coercively. This is quite apart from risks arising from unforeseen disruptions like weather or war or logistical problems. Integrating economic resilience into development is therefore, we feel, very urgent. And as far as India is concerned, we are now taking a broad fourfold approach. This is my assessment. First is closer scrutiny of inward FDI and restrict import of intrusive technology with surveillance and harmful potential from countries with which we have some concern. Thus, certain apps have been prohibited, certain technologies excluded from 5G trials, and some investments kept out. The second line of action is to enhance indigenous capacity and competitiveness. And during COVID-19 and the initial days of the Ukraine conflict, India's import vulnerabilities got demonstrated, particularly in respect of bulk drugs, semiconductors, electronic items, etc. There is, of course, also the urgency of climate transition. So, the Make in India program of the government has acquired vigor. The production-linked incentive schemes for manufacturing have been launched in 14 sectors that account for close to 40% of India's imports. These range from bulk drugs and medical devices to battery making, and from solar modules to mobile phones and laptops. The schemes have an outlay of US $26 billion. The aim is to attract investments in these key sectors and bring economies of size and scale in the manufacturing sector. A large semiconductor program has also been launched. This has an outlay of US $10 billion. India has also entered into MOUs on semiconductor development, both with the US and with Japan. And you can say that the present de-risking environment globally allows a conducive time for these initiatives. And of course, India's particular strengths are the large domestic demand and the demographic edge it has with rising percentage of working population, that is still to peak, and the domestic presence of a robust services sector offering advanced design and manufacturing solutions. Coming from Bangalore, where I stay, I can say this particularly effectively. Many projects are also on in the works towards strengthening the infrastructure, the highways network, the rail freight corridors, port infrastructure, logistics facilitation, and of course, these investment parks. The responses so far from the investors, both in respect of the PLI initiative and the semiconductor program, are quite encouraging. There is, however, also an awareness that it may create new dependencies, including on critical minerals. This is already happening in the imports of lithium and a few other items into India. So as a first step, the government has identified 30 critical minerals in June this year, based on their economic importance and supply risk. India is 100% import dependent on 10 of the identified critical minerals, including cobalt, nickel, lithium, and vanadium. Exploration projects for some identified sites are, however, underway, and the required legislative changes have been brought in, and also cabinet decisions have been taken recently to reduce the royalty rates to make it more attractive, and this will show that private sector participation, including foreign companies, are enabled. Now, the third line of action followed is to forge supply chain collaborations with friendly partners. The Quad and its initiatives have provided thrust. The supply chain pillar agreement of IPEF marks a generational change. India is also involved in bilateral and trilateral arrangements with Japan and Australia, as well as with the United States. Further, India has become a member of the Mineral Security Partnership and the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor is an ambitious initiative that saw a high-profile announcement jointly by several global leaders in September this year. Fourth, a major change is now India signing new FTAs after a pause of over 10 years. A comprehensive FTA with the UAE and an interim one with Australia was done last year. An FTA with the United Kingdom is also at an advanced stage. Negotiations, moreover, were active with the European Union, EFTA countries, Peru, GCC, to mention a few. A review of India-ASEAN FTA is also underway. Some of the FTA partners are also resource-rich that could help. The US and India are cooperating on trade somewhat differently. Resolve pending WTO disputes, which has been done, and accommodate on tariffs or other regulatory aspects on products of mutual interest. Cooperation on critical and emerging technologies and export controls form another important aspect. With an FTA currently not feasible, this may be the best way forward. Finally, as for IPEF itself, and if I could answer that last question on, from the Indian perspective, or from my perspective, I would say that I should not be representing the government, which I am not. The IPEF supply chain agreement, there are mixed opinions. This is also from the industry, the feelings that we get. Much work is also technical, assessing risks for each product and component, and putting in place levers to deal with them, and evaluating investment diversification needs. Whether companies will share data is a concern. There are also questions about its labor provisions, whether they may be used for undermining wage competitiveness. But if we have to move forward, in my own view, IPEF is a good agreement at this point of time, coming as it does. But if we have to move forward, building trust and reliability among the members, encouraging each other to understand from each other's best practices, and positive peer pressure will help. An APEC model of implementation, including annual leaders' summits, could make it work. Coming up with some quick action plans in a few critical supply chain areas will be important. If a process of mixing and matching from examining vulnerabilities results in new investments and diversification, it could attract interest. And of course, if it is possible to make IPEF partners access the US under the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, that would certainly make IPEF much more attractive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Seshadri. You addressed the question I was going to ask, the mixed picture related to IPEF and its work on supply chains, but I think you offered some practical ways in which to make it more attractive and more useful, so thank you. Maybe I'll go, in the interest of time, directly to Emily to conclude our formal presentations, and then we'll open this up. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to Jetro, and of course, Chris and Nick and Lauren for including me today. I love partnering with my Japan-focused colleagues because they always get such fantastic speakers, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I always learn so much from fellow panelists. Let me provide a little bit of contour from the US perspective, and let me begin with making one comment about globalization. And I think one fundamental question that we don't talk about quite enough, especially in Washington, is globalization as we know it fundamentally over, or is it changing? And it's actually a fairly difficult question to answer because the data are mixed. If you look at bilateral trade and investment with the US and China, last year it hit an all-time high. This year we've heard it's precipitously down. If you listen to China's ambassador to Washington, that's largely attributable to US rhetoric about China. If you listen to US economists, it's an economic downturn in China and various other domestic policies that are somewhat coercive, that are chilling FDI in China. However, there's interesting data that's out, I think 2 weeks ago from the WTO, that shows that trade is still actually growing globally, but it's looking and feeling different. And rather than globalization as we know it, trade is having this new clustering effect. And I think that's early data to support that friendshoring actually is underway. That doesn't mean that friendshoring will look monolithic across the board. And so I would like to make a couple of points about 3 commonalities and 3 differences that the United States has in regards to economic engagement vis-a-vis its partners. So let me begin with 3 key differences that I observe. The first is the degree to which the United States regards China as a threat rather than a customer. This difference is, I think, particularly acute with certain European allies. I'm thinking of Germany here, where the end goal is to maintain as robust as trade with China as possible. The United States is increasingly seeing China as a threat, and this manifests in the use of an expanded national security toolkit in what has traditionally been trade and econ. So that's the second big difference, is using an expanded national security toolkit. We heard from Christina Siegel-Knowles earlier that the United States has put forth a very far-reaching outbound investment screening initiative. Japan is one of the only other countries in the world to have something that looks like an outbound screening tool. Is substantively very different. The US approach is to screen outbound capital and knowledge transfers, know-how, particularly in the venture capital setting, on 3 specific sectors, which are chips, quantum technology, and AI. We also have an expanded set of restrictions, which Japan has joined on advanced semiconductors in the export control context. So we really see efforts to protect against leakage of high-grade technology to countries that the United States thinks could use this technology against us in the future. A third major policy difference is the centrality or perhaps lack thereof of international institutions in trade. We see the United States continuing to pull back in certain ways from the WTO. Just a couple of days ago, we saw the US remove its initials. I wouldn't call it backing out of the e-commerce talks at the WTO, but we really are experiencing a sea change, and it's away from these traditional institutions to a new landscape that looks and feels different. A couple of commonalities. One is that de-risking, I think, is preferred by all parties over decoupling. We see this not only in the European Union economic security strategy that was released in June, the subsequent German strategy on China that was released in July, and the current updates to the Japanese economic security strategy. So we really do see a lot of allied buy-in to this new agenda, which is we need to have a backup plan. We need to be able to obtain critical inputs to our supply chains so that we can keep our own economies up and running. A second commonality is that allied economies will probably have to continue to contend with higher costs. None of this is free, but the current assessment is that the risks of inaction are simply too high. And so prices will inevitably go up, but the benefits will probably outweigh the costs, at least when it comes to rote security concerns. The third is that jointly allied economies will have to contend with Chinese retaliation. We saw this over summer with the gallium and germanium export restrictions following the implementation of the Dutch and Japanese licensing updates on export controls, and then more recently, the graphite restrictions. These are country agnostic. I think there's reason to believe that they are mostly a warning shot to turn the temperature down, not to ratchet up additional controls. If you look at some of the private sector responses, the private sector continues to say, not to worry, we can scale up processing, we can actually implement the necessary changes to build a more resilient supply chain, specifically on certain critical minerals. I think where we get a little bit lost is that we're not seeing sufficient follow through on that very immediate need. And that's a role that the government can play in close concert with the private sector, is really to identify places and investment policy changes that would actually enable that last bit of the supply chain to get off the ground. So just a small dose of reality to conclude is I think that we probably are not, as an American, rejoining CPTPP anytime soon. That's probably unlikely to change, even if political leadership in the United States changes. We are facing a new reality. Supply chains are the new multilateral trading system that will, again, look and feel very different. I think we need to start thinking about what needs to come next in terms of global economic governance. Our continued reliance on, well, what if we could go back, I think in some ways it's restraining a more powerful conversation that would actually help us get to this next level of deeper economic engagement. The last thing I'll note is that we probably need to start thinking more closely about which supply chains are actually critical to economic security. And that's where the Biden administration has been, I think, particularly astute, is that they came into office and identified medical supply chains, large capacity batteries, critical minerals, and semiconductors as very crucial to continued resilience in the American economy. The buck probably doesn't stop there, so we'll have to jointly figure out where we can deepen cooperation on other critical supply chains. So let me leave it there for now.
That was terrific, Emily, as always. Thank you. So I'm about to open this up to the audience. So I'd invite people who have questions to begin to make your way to the microphone over here. But in the meantime, Emily, maybe just a follow-up question for you, and perhaps Dr. Todo, you may wish to comment on this as well. So Emily, you noted that increasingly, in the sort of the differences category, U.S. views increasingly China as a threat, more aggressive use of this new national security toolkit. You noted the pullback from some existing institutions related to international trade, in particular the WTO. Then you also said there's a lot of allied backup. I think that was your phrase on this as well. But to Dr. Todo's point about, even in the case of Japan, the continued importance of China to Japan's trade and economic picture. Is this, as you look at this, as you net all this out, particularly in the US-Japan context, but perhaps more broadly, is this an area of increasing divergence between the United States and Japan going forward? Or is it one where our interests will converge more than they diverge? How do you think about that? Oh, Emily, do you want to start?
I think it depends, which is a little bit of a lazy answer, but if the United States continues to pursue the use of unilateral tools when it comes to national security, I think that could force a greater divergence. However, there is great utility in, I think, effectively communicating what the actual risks are. It is in everyone's interest to have resilient supply chains. And if you look at the Dutch, Japanese, US deal on semiconductors, it seems like each country was able to identify very immediate national security risks from high-grade, very powerful AI chips. And that alone was the motivating factor to get 3 separate countries to exercise different points, choke points over their own supply chains. And so I think that alone demonstrates that we can walk in the same direction, but the United States will have to do, I think, a more effective job of figuring out how to offset some of the costs. And this is where traditional trade policy can really come in handy, is helping identify alternative marketplaces, getting business deals done, and that seems like the next inevitable chapter of this new economic security agenda.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on this question about whether there's convergence or divergence in U.S. views on this? Maybe Dr. Todo, I don't know if you would like to, since you in particular sort of highlighted the continuing importance of China, how do you think about this as an issue in U.S.-Japan relations?
Actually, I'm not really emphasizing the importance of China from the perspective of Japanese economy. Of course, we pretty much rely on China currently, but still I'm arguing that we need to reduce the reliance on China and diversify our supply chains to the global south and also to the US and Europe and other developed G7 countries. Because G7 countries are kind of close friends, like-minded countries. So, yeah, in a sense, maybe my presentation was a bit misleading, but yeah. So I think in any case, we need a kind of a diversification of supply chains. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's start to take some questions over here. We'll start them one at a time. I may need to group them as we go forward.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for a very informative session. Kiwami Sato from George Washington University, undergraduate student. I'd like to ask Dr. The Seshadri, is my pronunciation correct? Okay, thank you. About the Indian future, about the relationship with Japan and US, especially my concern about the Indian relationship, I mean a diplomatic relationship, economic relationship is the connection with the BRICS. India is still the part of the BRICS, tie with China and Russia, and but Russia started the invasion in Ukraine, and China raises the tension in Taiwan region. So my question is, there are 3 questions. Firstly, what would Indian position would be in the future about the BRICS? And secondly, what if China expand its influence in that group, like the China expand influence in Russia, and Russia becoming a little bit kind of junior partner of China. So what if the China expand its influence in BRICS more and more? And lastly, the Professor Todo mentioned that Japan and the US have to attract the global south into the Western supply chain group. So what India want Japan and US to shift the part of the Western supply chain? Thank you.
My hearing moderator to help me. My hearing is not great. So could you help me exactly?
In a nutshell, right? India's view on the role of the BRICS
Yes.
and the sort of the competing tensions, right? Between, on the one hand, this the focus on supply chain resilience, but also the historical ties to Russia and others, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
What is the question?
So how do you rationalize India's role in the BRICS and engagement in that forum with this agenda that you've set out?
How do we envisage engaging in which forum?
India's role in BRICS and how it relates to Russia and the rest of the region.
No. We have a fairly good relationship with all the countries, and we endeavor to do that. All the same, what I have been trying to convey, and I hope the message is very clear, that we have to look at our import dependence. To give you an idea about India, which is somewhat different from Southeast Asia, our import dependence, we import 158% of our exports. This is not something that you will find anywhere in Southeast Asia. And certainly this import dependence will rise in the coming years if we were to also use critical minerals and all the rest. So if we have to look at ahead, we have to see how to manage this economy in a manner that will sustain growth. That is why I pointed out the 14 sectors where we have the core competence to manufacture them, or investors come in and invest. If we can reduce that import dependence, to the extent we can also be able to enable export expansion of needed commodities. Now, certainly during COVID time, we also experienced certain difficulties as a result, for example, bulk drugs. A large economy like India, 1.4 billion, suddenly you find certain shortages. It's not easy. So government is trying to create a certain degree of domestic availability to cushion import dependence. That is the crux of the matter. And this really is not just depending on any particular country, etc., but more in terms of our own growth. And we are trying to do this in partnership, in collaboration with various countries. So it is not directed against any country, nor is it contravening our cooperation in any other forum like BRICS or elsewhere. Have I made that clear?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And, I'd like to ask one more question.
I think we need to move on to the next.
Okay.
We have a long line. So why don't we collect two questions, two following behind you. Thank
you so much.
No, yeah, thank you. Let's do two questions, and then we'll answer, and then we'll get the final two as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel. I learned a lot. My name is Niharika Joe. I'm with the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission, and I like to say I was born and raised in India, grew up in the United States, and work on U.S.-Japan relations. And so when Emily, you spoke about globalization, for me growing up, globalization meant Americanization. And because I was growing up in India, and it was very American. And now as we talk about more integrated and globalized supply chains, my question really is to Shanti about what you said, about corruption. And when we're talking about complicated supply chains like in India, how do we specifically address corruption? And the complications result in not just talking high level about supply chains related to semiconductors and whatnot, but when we're going down to the SME level or below that, how do we deal with that? And just anecdotally, yes, after COVID, it became very apparent that supply chains were important because the Xbox game station was coming from China, and every household that had kids at home was talking about how it was delayed. So my question is, how do we do this sustainably? How do we address climate issues? And how do we control corruption?
One more question, please.
Hello there. My name is Ujwal Upaluri. I'm from Customs and Border Protection, Office of Trade, the Green Trade Strategy Team. And the question that I have for the panel is, one of the big issues facing much of Southeast Asia is, especially when it comes to projects, it could be infrastructure projects, investments, is how do we make them sustainable and in partnership with the local communities? Because in Africa, in Asia, and in many parts of the developing world, a big issue that local communities have had is that their environment, their natural environment is being ruined, that their people are falling sick, that they're running into all sorts of issues and troubles. So how can we here in the United States, India, Japan, work to perhaps present an alternative model of economic development and social development to these local communities such that they decide to prefer us as being their investment partners to build these projects rather than, say, countries such as China or Russia, which may not be going into these regions with the same mindset.
Thank you. Ms. Shamdasani, would you like to take a stab at this? The second question really hit on some of the themes you addressed as well, so perhaps you could hit both of those if you would.
Right. Just very quickly, I think, with regards to corruption, what currently is happening, and I would like to particularly point on IPEF, we are on the right track. Now, the issue in terms of how do we ensure that corruption in this part of the world or drive the agenda, supply chain agenda, without having corruption holding us back, because we have seen this in some of the countries, is that to really look at the example of the digital transformation we had initially. When we first started with the digital transformation in the customs area, where initially it was manual and then it was changed to really, computerized, modern custom clearance and whatnot. We had a lot of resistance. And at some point, the custom officials would pretend that the machine is broken so that they can go back to manual and they can go back to do their own thing, right? It's going to take time. It's a slow process. But what we need to also see in this process of really re-energizing the supply chain industry is to look more at the human aspect and explain to them what this new transformation is going to look like and how it's going to benefit them vis-a-vis threat them. I think when people view something as a threat, their immediate reaction would be to oppose it, right? So I think that would be one issue here. And then the other question you have is climate change, corruption, sustainability, and I think, and the role of SMEs here. SMEs have often been left out when we talk about international negotiations and all that. It's normally the top multinational companies, the senior officials sitting there, and SMEs have been left to the domestic governments to really take a look into it. Now, how do SMEs actually begin to start supporting? Because in Southeast Asia or in Indonesia itself, the economy is being driven by SMEs, at least 40 to 60%. I know in India it's a larger number. So this is one big element of an economic driver that we are actually forgetting when we are talking about high-level trade negotiations or high-level partnerships. So really to incorporate. In the interest of time, I cannot elaborate this, but maybe I can share this in a later forum. But there are 5 methods where you can actually incorporate the participation of SMEs into this drive to really bring them together in the same train. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're running short on time, so very quickly, if I could ask you to be concise in your questions, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Chatrali. I'm a master's student at Georgetown University. And the quick question I had for Ambassador Seshadri and Todo-san is that India and Japan signed their free trade agreement back in 2011. But if you see the situation now, there is this very huge trade deficit between the two. And I wanted to ask how exactly are the two countries coming together to deal with this massive trade deficit that they have, and how can APEC or IPEF bring these two countries to have, greater trade relations? And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. The India-Japan FTA and its impact. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kensuke Abe, Marubeni Corporation, a Japanese private company. So I would just ask the panel, especially Professor Todo and Emily, about the G7's coordination platform on economic cohesion. So especially I'm curious about the deterrence part. So how do you think, how and what kind of tools this platform would deploy for deterrence against economic cohesion? So does it mean G7 members and partners also could implement economic cohesion as a countermeasure to the aggressors? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's start, Dr. Seshadri, with the Japan-India FTA question.
So India and Japan signed an agreement in 2011, and there have been a lot of trade deficit. Now, how do IPEF and IPEF help manage this trade deficit?
Yeah, how is the FTA working, and how can IPEF help further bridge the gap between India and Japan economically?
I mentioned about the level of trade deficits. We have, in fact, our imports, I will tell you, all the Southeast Asian countries or East Asian countries, our imports from Japan is 3 times the exports from India, and likewise from Korea and Australia. Our import from China is 6 times the exports to China. And our imports from ASEAN are twice that of our exports to ASEAN. So in a sense, we have FTAs with ASEAN, ASEAN, Japan, and Korea. With ASEAN, we are trying to review the agreement. We hope it will make it more balanced. Likewise, we have been seeking reviews of FTA with Japan and Korea. But deficits is only one side of the story. I don't think we can look at trade purely in terms of deficits, because what we get from Japan, for example, that you mentioned, a lot of capital equipment. There are also part of it coming under JICA aid programs. So you will have to look at in the totality how it is helping you transform your economy. And most important, are you able to access those markets without any hindrances? That is the issue. And that is where we have some issues with some of the countries, and we are taking it up with them bilaterally. But we are not really looking for balance, but we are trying, for instance, to give you the Japan trade. What is the single largest item of import today from Japan into India? Can anybody of you guess? It is platinum grade elements, $1.7 billion. So you can see how the trade is changing from what used to be electronics, machinery, etc. We are moving to climate transition elements, and this is likely to go up. So we have to be able to plan for this future, to be able to provide space for some of these elements which are not available in India. But that cannot be done unless you expand your domestic capacity, which is what we are trying to do. And that's how I put across as part of our 4-point program.
Great, thank you. Now I'll invite Emily and then Dr. Todo to address the question of the G7 economic coercion mechanism.
Sure, just very quickly, I think there are a couple of interesting takeaways about the Allied response to economic coercion. First is that we have a colleague at CSIS who's written a very interesting study effectively showing that Chinese economic coercive behavior does not succeed, and not only does it not succeed in the long run, but it actually deters additional FDI into China. So the takeaway there is don't engage in economic coercive behavior. I think that is a takeaway that the United States and its close partners have realized. And there's a second CSIS paper that I would recommend by Dr. Victor Cha that says, look, the United States doesn't necessarily have a lot of choke points that it could engage if it wanted to retaliate or coerce China. I think they pretty much boil down to intellectual property, particularly in the high-tech sector. However, if the United States bands together with its G7 allies and then you add Australia into the mix, we have about 400 items, products, on which China depends on this G7 plus 4 critical inputs. And the lesson there is that one country alone cannot really stand up and effectively combat coercive behavior, but together as a bloc, we do have tremendous market power, but it's probably better if we scale up and have a more affirmative, cooperative agenda than trying to engage in tit-for-tat retaliation, because that will only incur higher costs and will probably harm us in the long run.
Thank you, Emily. Dr. Todo?
I think nothing to add. But can I answer to a question from the gentleman over there about the infrastructure? Actually, so infrastructure development should be associated with technical assistance. For example, the Japanese official aid is providing a technical assistance in the case of subway construction in Indonesia. So they use very much state-of-the-art technology at the time, and so they trained Indonesian engineers to transfer the technology. So that's one good example of like infrastructure which can contribute to the local development. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And this has been, I think, a very rich panel discussion. This brings us to the end of our annual CSIS Jetro conference. I want to thank all of you here and online for joining us. If you would, please take a minute to consider filling out a survey to help us improve this event in the future. There'll be a QR code here for those here, and then online, our audience can find it as well. But please join me in a round of applause for our panelists, and thank you again to Chairman Ishiguro and Jetro for